I'm Kyle Malnati, your host of the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast. At Calibrate, we exist to help people create generational wealth through real estate. My personal mission is to encourage, empower, and educate you by sharing best practices from business leaders that are proven winners. Broadcasting from the Mile High City. Thank you for tuning in to episode 125 of the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast. 125 podcast episodes in the books. Thank you. If you joined us at episode 120 or episode 20 or episode 1, I'm just appreciative of your download today. This is going to be an exciting episode where we're talking about the apartment market. As many of you may know, I operate Calibrate Real Estate as a brokerage firm, and I'm the CEO of that firm, but my day-to-day is spent a lot of the time selling apartment buildings. And the apartment market is a critical piece of the economy, and this is a really cool opportunity for us to simulcast an event that was a live event, sort of a virtual panel done by BussinessDen or Business Denver. The panelists include two of my favorite people in the apartment market, Bobby Hutchinson, a former coworker of mine, Chief Investment Officer at Red Peak, Svi Radowski, CEO at Boutique Apartments and Principal of Wheelhouse Construction. Along with Bobby and Svi, joined them with Chris Waggett, Brian Wynn, and David Zucker, all heavy hitters in the Denver apartment market. And this was all moderated by BussinessDen's Thomas Gounley. Thomas Gounley is someone that I've actually met in person. He's interviewed us. Great guy, Thomas. And so thank you so much for allowing us to simulcast this. Before we get into this discussion, which I'll just say from Main Street, from all the people that are talking to me on a daily basis in the apartment market, they're wondering what's happening with delinquencies. How many, and that means just in layman's terms, how many tenants that are living in apartments aren't paying rent? So we're going to discuss that. How many tenants are not renewing? How many tenants are not going out there and actually looking at new apartments? And what are vacancy rates? Things of that sort. So this discussion is going to be meat and potatoes for our core audience. If you're listening to this podcast or watching it on YouTube, if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, this is a broadcast of a larger audience than we normally do. Normally, our podcast emails go out to a smaller group that like to listen to best practices about how real estate brokerage is done. This may be going out to you as an apartment owner, and I would encourage you to listen in to our podcast on a regular basis. You can do that by subscribing. You just hit the subscribe button on Apple Podcasts. That's our favorite. And if you are willing to give us a 5-star review, we would love it. Without further ado, to keep this brief, this is Business Denver's assembly on the apartment market. This is real time. The last couple of podcasts we've done have been very related to the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. We're recording this here in May, and this is accurate information about the past 3 months worth of apartment operations from some of Denver's largest landlords. So without further ado, Thomas Gounley will kick it off here. I'm Kyle Malnati, and as I love to say, we will see you around the neighborhood. Thanks, everybody.
All right, it looks like we are live and our viewers are joining us. Good morning, everyone. My name is Thomas Gounley. Welcome to BussinessDen Assembly. I'm one of the reporters and an editor here at BussinessDen. I've got 5 panelists with me today, and I'll be introducing them momentarily. So BussinessDen Assembly is, maybe some of you have joined into our previous ones, but basically we're just trying to check the pulse of various sectors and industries in Denver by talking to local owners and CEOs, business leaders. So today we're talking about apartments and the multifamily sector, both in terms of large landlords and the property management side of things, as well as the development side of things. So we've kind of got a mix of people from both of those today. And now let's jump into our panelists. I'm just going to go with the order that they appear on my screen, which may or may not match the one you have at home. But in my upper left, we've got Bobby Hutchinson, the Chief Investment Officer at Denver-based Red Peak, which is a major landlord, owns about 3,200 units in Denver and Glendale, and has grown sizably over the last couple of years through acquisitions. Bobby, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. It's great to be here. You've assembled a terrific panel today, so I'm appreciative to be a part of it. We're a Denver-based multifamily investment company. We invest exclusively in the Denver metro area, with about 90% of our portfolio in Denver. We've got 2 suburban assets. Average unit size of our buildings is in 64 units per property. So we've got 50 buildings within the 3,200, and happy to be here to talk about what we've seen since the pandemic has begun.
Awesome. And in my upper right, we've got Chris Waggett, the founding partner and CEO of Denver-based D4 Urban, the master planner behind Broadway Park, which is a kind of retail hub at the corner of Broadway and Alameda that's essentially being transformed into a new neighborhood with a bunch of multifamily development. The firm has co-developed one of those properties, also sold off parcels to notable developers like Amley Residential. Chris, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. Pleasure to be here. And as you just said, so my focus is exclusively on 70 acres. We've got a raft of deals in the works at the moment. We've got $250,000 either on site or about to go on site, bond raising that's in the middle of the process. So we're busy. And of course, we have 72 tenants as well, commercial tenants, retail tenants. And so that provides interesting challenges at this time as well. So thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. And then we've got David Zucker, the CEO of Denver-based Okolo Community Development, which has done and is doing a number of multifamily projects, including currently constructing at River North, not far from the 38th and Blake Station in Rhino. Also preparing to break ground on something in Lakewood, planning a project in Boulder, Sloan's Lake. David, thanks for joining us.
Thanks everybody. And first, happy birthday to Chris. So no hard questions for Chris on his birthday. Zoglo is a vertically integrated general contractor, developer, and property manager, and I think those 3 attributes give us an interesting view in troubled, challenging times. So I'm looking forward to being able to share thoughts that I have with the other panelists, as smart as everyone on this group is.
And next we've got Zvi Rudowski, the CEO of Portis, which manages about 4,200 units, many of them in the Denver metro area, but some elsewhere in the state, under the Wheelhouse and Boutique apartment brands. Zvi, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Yeah, we as Thomas had mentioned, we primarily focus on the Front Range, Denver, Aurora, although we have a portfolio of properties that we manage up in the mountains. We have a large complex up in Leadville that we manage, one in Silverthorne, and then one that we just recently took over in Fraser. So we've got a pretty good footprint and pulse of what's going on in Colorado at this point.
And lastly, we've got Brian Wynn, the president and co-founder of Wynn Yasmer Real Estate, Denver-based multifamily development and investment company. Their project's currently in the planning stages. Before that, he was a senior director at Mill Creek Residential, working on their Denver area projects. Brian, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Yes, as Thomas mentioned, we are in the early stages of a couple of multifamily development projects in the Denver metro area, about 400 units between them. And during this cycle, developed about 2,000 units in Denver. So happy to be on the panel, really looking forward to the insights of the other panelists, and really appreciate the opportunity to join.
So I'm going to start with the 3 panelists that either own or manage or both a large number of apartments at this point, and that's Bobby, David, and Zvi. I want to ask you guys what your rent collections basically been like for April and May, and how that compares to normal, how many tenants are late, things like that. Bobby, let's start with you. What has the picture been like at Red Peak?
Sure. So we were, we were, as most owners, pretty worried about, what collections would be like from the start of the pandemic, and didn't really quite know what to expect. But as many owners have experienced, we ended up in a pretty favorable relative to what it could have been in April, and so we ended up 2.5% delinquent in April. Comparatively, we would typically, our delinquency would be below 1%, and so certainly higher than normal, but given the current situation, better than we anticipated. Where we sit today, as of last night, so we're currently 7.4% delinquent in May. But what's interesting is through the same time in April, we were 7.9%. And so we've seen, we're actually performing better in May to this point, which gives us some hope as how we may finish up the balance of the month. And we do have a program we've put in place to kind of enable people to pay throughout the month, which is what has enabled us to go from the 7.9 where we were at this point in April to 2.5 where we ended up. So overall, I think we're feeling better than what we had anticipated heading into April.
Got it. Thank you. David, what does the picture look like at Zocalo Properties?
In that we own senior age qualified, high-end market, call it B market rate, and affordable. It really is the tale of different cities. For understandable reasons, the age qualified over 55 has very low deferral, almost zero. Our A property coda has suffered some, but not a high degree, probably about 4%, 5%. B properties are about 6. Most concerning, and this is really the human tragedy, a manifestation of the human tragedy, our First and Broadway 4% tax credit project had 16% deferral or non-payment in April, and 24% this month. So it's really expressing the sadness of the human toll. So what we've described, and Bobby, I'm sure you're doing the same, Zvi, the same, that empathy among our management team is critical. We do not want to create greater anxiety or nervousness in our residents. So we're in some ways taking the Hippocratic rental oath: do no emotional damage.
Got it. And Zvi, you're a little different from the last two in that you are managing properties on behalf of tons of different owners, but you've got 4,200 units or so. That's a ton. What has the numbers been like for you, and does it vary a lot across the types of things you have in your portfolio?
Sure, Thomas. So as of the close of business yesterday, what we've been doing is tracking basically the last 3 months on a daily basis, and as of March 13th, we were at a 6.43% delinquency, which might be a little bit higher than normal, but not atypical. As of April 13th, we were at 10.23% delinquent, and then as of yesterday, we were at 11.58%. And I think we're seeing a lot of similarities between what David was explaining, and we arbitrarily broke the properties down into Class A, B, and C. And so Class A are, it's not your typical Class A that's brand new, highly amenitized, but they're newer properties that have been extensively renovated. Class B are some level of renovation, and Class C are decent properties, but maybe in a little bit tougher areas, like the mountains. And so we are seeing a pretty big disparity between the three classes. So As of yesterday, our Class A was 3.47% delinquent. Our Class B was 6.72% delinquent, and our Class C is 22.85% delinquent. So, yeah, that's really tough. And you know, early on, we really started communicating with our residents. We created a COVID application so that the people that could not pay rent could at least let us know, fill out an application, and then we are working with every single one of those residents on a one-to-one basis to try to figure out how to keep them in their apartments. And I think that you know, I'm pleased with May so far. I was very, very worried that May would be a lot worse, but I think what's happened is unemployment funds are coming in, stimulus funds are coming in, and so folks are able to pay. You know, I question what's going to happen next month.
Yep. Brian, you have no tenants to speak of. What if any impacts of the coronavirus and the economic fallout have there been to the planning of your projects?
So we've been really obviously trying to make sense of how to approach development, and being in the early stage of development right now is interesting. On a couple of projects we're looking at, we're a year away from starting construction on those projects, and then 2 years of construction-ish. So we're looking at about 3 years before we deliver a product to the market. We do feel confident that in that 3-year time frame, there is going to be demand for the product that we're developing, and we feel good about the communities that we have in the planning process now. But we are starting to closely look at design and amenities and certain other attributes to the development as to how we might respond to this on the back end. And it's really a tough prediction as to how the resident population, the customer base, is going to perceive fairly dense multifamily housing coming on the back end of this pandemic. So there's a lot of guesswork, and but some things we are looking at is just the expansion of amenity areas, certainly trying to embrace a work from home culture. We certainly don't think it's going to be binary and everyone's going to all of a sudden be working from home, but we think there could be an increase in working from home coming out of this. So we want to embrace that on the multifamily housing side. And then we're looking at some other things in terms of air quality, privacy, resident safety, things like that, to respond to what we're viewing as a pretty generational event, and will have impact on how the customer base approaches our communities in the future.
And Chris, you sold off a big chunk of land to Amley Residential, I believe early or mid-March, just as things were heating up. You've got other deals in the works. Have any of those been directly affected by the coronavirus?
Yeah, so closing Amley was critical for us. Obviously, sitting on cash is really important. We have Price Development Group under construction next to them, and I got a bunch of post-closing obligations. And we have a third deal, which is a joint venture, and we deliberately were changing our focus to participating in deals. And we have a joint venture with Transwestern Development coming out of Houston, Texas, and Houston's probably the worst market to be in at the moment with oil and gas as well as COVID. They were in the middle of equity negotiations, obviously as JV partner, rolling the land into that deal. We were right across that. That stopped dead in the water. We've given them more time. I'm quietly confident we'll get through that. The bigger issue for me is I've got a bond raising for our Metropolitan District, $26 million bond raising to pay back all the advances from when we did Denizen in 2014-15 and sold it in 17. And I was rather hoping to repatriate that money and distribute the Amley proceeds to our investors. So at the moment, you know, we've got cash, but we're having to see whether normalcy returns to the capital markets. And the pendulum has literally swung from you know, 2 months ago when it was a question of how oversubscribed would the bond raising be and how low would the yield be bid, to it's unfinanceable, to now the demand's coming back. The question is, what's the premium over what we were expecting before? So that's going to be a tough choice. Do we, you know, make that call? Because it ultimately translates to the mill levy on, you know, our existing retail tenants and those apartment buildings. So, you know, it's kind of a story, as in a way the guys were talking about on the different grades of apartment dweller. We've got good news on a sale, less good news on bonds, and uncertain news on another, you know, solid apartment deal.
Got it. Bobby, has the rent strike mentality been a factor at all in your portfolio with your tenants?
You know, we've received a few notices that, you know, that come from various rent strike groups that talk about, you know, inability to pay. What we've done, and I think that as David and Svi had mentioned, that it's imperative to be communicating early and often with people that are impacted. And so we've done that consistently, and I think that that's, we feel that that's enabled us, along with deferment plans where we'll defer half of the rent over the following 6 months to kind of address a lot of the issues. Where we have gotten rent strike emails, we've been able to reach out and to talk to those folks. There's been a small number that have been unresponsive. You know, we do have some people that are delinquent, that aren't responding, that and there's, you know, right now you can't move towards evictions or late fees, and so those will be dealt with in the future. But the majority of people have been receptive, and you know, one of the things that we think has enabled us to have some success is that if you think about the people that are most impacted, and you know, I think right now anybody that's under $40,000 per year, the unemployment rate within that group is about 40%. But the thing that we've seen that I think that has enabled us to have stronger collections and to kind of stave off some of the rent strike talk is what the benefit that came through in the CARES Act did from an unemployment benefit perspective, to add the 600 per week. So that on top of the 400 average per week unemployment in the state of Colorado, really has led to, you know, about 80% of unemployed people right now currently making more money. And so, you know, while you do get some people that come at you with the rent strike, what we've found is a lot of times that if those people are you know, utilizing the resources that are available through the government from an unemployed benefit perspective, that they, you know, probably have, you know, the money to pay rent. And it's then a question if they're going to prioritize rent over other payments, and so, you know, obligations they have. And so, you know, we think that could, you know, gain some legs as the year goes on. The biggest thing that we're concerned about, I'd say, is that, you know, right now the CARES Act $600 unemployment boost ends at the end of July. And so, you know, it's part of the HEROES Act that's being debated right now that would add an additional $3 trillion, would extend that through January of 2021. And so, you know, that to us is a big thing. If those benefits stay in place, then we think that the real risk of the rent strike phenomenon taking hold is somewhat limited if the unemployment benefits can stay with us until there's, you know, better therapeutics and hopefully a vaccine.
And David, you're the only one up here that is currently today building an apartment complex at River North, 3463 Walnut Street. You know, construction's been essential this whole time. Nobody's been required to stop. Did the pandemic affect things day to day on that project?
I think in the main, for developers and contractors in construction today, it has in two negative ways, and for some of us, it's helped in a third positive way. Some projects are being shut down. Municipalities, understandably, are giving broad latitude to code enforcers and those that are reviewing project construction. And so there, some are being shut down because of COVID or other issues. Neighborhood groups, for instance, are using that as they have in Boulder, as a means of shutting construction because the social distancing isn't being kept on a construction site, which is tough. The governor subsequently fixed that, but projects were in fact shut down by neighborhoods. So projects shut down because of inspectors. Second is that financial conditions have shut down projects for lack of funding, typically commercial or retail. But then the consequential benefit is that there are subcontractors that have staff that are looking for a project because they are pushed off those. So our labor force has increased probably by about 15 to 25% on some days. So that's great. So any, I don't know if we'll be delivering early, but we certainly, any days that we were late because of weather or other issues leading up to the virus, we seem to be catching up. So, and as a result, we are taking it really, really seriously. We have 40 hand washing stations. We are taking steps to ensure that we have as much social distancing and protocols of riding in elevators and the buck hoists, where it's only materials, people use the stairs. So there's a set of protocols that are pretty strictly enforced, including face covering as well. And so all of those things keeping our River North project, it's a big project, $100 million project. So it'll be on time, if not perhaps a little bit ahead of time. Obviously, the concerning thing is what we'll find when we, in the economic and absorption market, when we get out and start leasing and open up the property in August of next year.
And Zvi, what has it been like in terms of new leases and lease renewals at this time? Are you having to market in a different way than you normally would?
Yeah, so what was difficult is when we had the shelter in place order, we basically stopped all showings from a physical standpoint. So none of our prospects were able to go see any apartments. What we did is we've been working on a virtual platform probably for the last year, and we were planning to roll that out this summer. Well, we really made changes very quickly in order to roll it out immediately. And so what that entails is 3D tours. We have a camera that basically will allow us to do, a really good detailed 3D tour. So we really kicked that up. YouTube video tours, make sure that we've got really good pictures, got good floor plans, FaceTime walkthroughs, and just really increasing the phone calls and the communication with our agents and applicants. What we've seen is basically during the last couple months, the lowest amount of leases that we received in a week basis was between April 6th and 12th, and we received 23 leases. I'm really happy to see that last week we bounced back. We got 51 leases. We would expect to be at around 65 to 75 leases per week at this point. But one of the, looking forward numbers, now that we're able to do, physical showings with social distancing, is that booked tours for the next 15 days. We have 216 booked tours for the next 15 days. Previous to that, we were running at about 50 tours that were booked. So, people are out there looking at apartments, and it's just how we do it and make sure that everybody keeps safe is the key at this point.
And Brian, one thing that's obviously been a huge help in spurring the multifamily development in Denver over the past decade is that Denver is this hip, cool city that millennials want to come to. Do you see the migration trend changing as a result of this, particularly if we have less of those service type jobs that many people hold when they first move out here?
Yes, I'd say that's one of the concerns as we look at, our business is really driven by demographics and the behavior of those demographics. So of course we had millennials, huge number of people. I don't think that's a concern as the next generation coming behind them is very large as well. So I think that potential pool of individuals that can make use of our communities that we're developing and potential residents is still going to be very large. But what might be a concern coming on the back end of this is really the behavior and the preferences within those groups. And migration, as you mentioned, has been an absolute huge factor for Denver multifamily. It's such a draw. People love to move here. The number of folks in migrating domestically is incredible. And in the communities that we've leased up in the past, we've seen quite a few folks from out of town, coastal markets, Chicago, huge in-migration markets for Denver. That's a big question. I think that's probably one of the biggest concerns facing our industry coming out of this is that if migration decreases, whether it's because you're just staying close to home, you can work remotely, you can perhaps stay closer to family, there would be an impact on our business on the back end of this. Now, on the flip side, I think we could be the beneficiary of migration patterns coming out of this as well. If some of the much denser markets start to experience continued out migration, which they already were prior to the COVID hitting, if that increases, Denver, of course, would be at the top of the list to be the beneficiary. I know a lot of people that live in Colorado, we feel like downtown Denver is dense. It's really not when you compare it to the coastal markets and some other major cities. So we could be seen as a little bit of a less dense destination that really fits the lifestyle that people are looking to live on the back end of the coronavirus epidemic. So there's some potential silver linings, but we do have concerns as well about that demand and what's been driving that demand in the past and how well that will hold up.
And Chris, I'm going to throw that same question to you. If you have different thoughts, I'll also add a second part. Do you see this situation changing the types or the amounts of amenities that developers incorporate?
Yeah, so I think Brian characterized the kind of pros and cons of the argument of Denver. All I have heard is very, very positive things. I've heard nothing but positive stories about move from denser coast to Colorado. I'm hearing lots of New Yorkers fleeing out of the city, but I'm also hearing a lot of people starting to say, you know what, lifestyle matters. Remote working means I can be anywhere. And I think that's a net benefit to Colorado. And as somebody who moved here 13 years ago, who's been FaceTiming with family overseas for the last 13 years, I can attest to how amazing the lifestyle here is. So I net am an optimist. I do think we've got to avoid knee-jerk reactions. Now, that's not to say we're not in a really dire situation. We are. And I think what everybody said about how it's hitting across the income spectrum is spot on. And of course, you know, retail has been, so to move into your other question, how's it going to affect things? You know, from our point of view, we planned a mixed income, mixed use, mixed tenure community. And so if anything, all this is doing is reinforcing the fundamentals. And I've got 2 other residential deals. David will be interested. I was intensely interested by his comment. We've got an affordable housing deal that I'm doing that's going for Chaffer this year. It'll be going in for August. It's a joint venture on a ground lease and nobody knows about it yesterday, the first time I publicly said anything. So we're pretty excited about that. And I think that, but David's given me a caution because of the challenge on that income spectrum. We have another joint venture with a local group we've been talking to for 5 years. And they came to us with a proposal since COVID has hit. And that was a huge shot in the arm for our vision. And they're very optimistic about what we're planning. I think so I often say to people, you have cyclical changes that occur, the cycles in the economy, and you have secular disruptions. We're in a secular disruption. The question is, how does it play out long term? And to my mind, there are certain changes that are just going to get accelerated because of this. And clearly retail is one of them. Retail is never going to come back the same way. I've made more progress in retail renegotiation. I've got 72 retail tenants. And I can tell you half of them have needed to have conversations with me. And I've made more progress in 6 weeks than I've made in 6 years. So I can tell you, it's amazing how times like this clarify and sharpen the focus and get results we should have got before. Arguably Denver, as long as Denver doesn't do stupid, and I think we're incredibly fortunate to have a governor who's behaving responsibly. And I think states don't realize at the moment they're producing an advert for people who are a community that future residents are going to want to move to, future businesses are going to move to, because it's the actions they're taking now that really tell you what their values are. And I think that is a huge shot in the arm for Denver. So to me, we're going to see continued growth. The form of our growth is going to be different. Retail will be less. I've always been a believer that you've got to have at least a Juliet, if not a balcony in an apartment. Don't understand apartments that don't have it. And I think this is going to change that. Patios on outside eating is going to become standard. Denver should have done it a long time ago. They'll probably get there eventually. So I think, an office remains a question. I think people are reacting far too in the moment, knee jerk, and hopefully it'll come back in a different form. But Brian's comment about density on a relative basis, we're not as dense, and we're very appealing. So I think when we get through this, and you've got to look through it, you've got to survive it, I think Denver, Colorado is relatively speaking well positioned.
And Bobby, Red Peak hasn't done any development in recent years, but you guys have been growing a ton through acquisitions. You bought a sizable chunk of Poets Row and Cap Hill towards the end of last year. What's your outlook on acquiring more buildings, as 2020 moves on?
So, I mean, we're definitely still, looking for deals. We did close on a property at the end of March it was a 3-building small portfolio that we'd had under contract since January and had in-place financing, and it was, fully leased, essentially fully renovated. As we look forward, I think the biggest, challenge is in certain segments of the market, there's probably less. Multifamily overall is very fortunate to have very strong financing stability by way of Fannie and Freddie. And so, that remains to be the case, but a good portion of our portfolio contains smaller buildings, and the availability of good debt capital is a little bit less as you get under, say, $7.5 million or so. So that's a concern. That's something that we watch closely with some of the banks that are, Chase notably, that's, pulled back, that we do a lot of loans with. The biggest challenge, I would say, initially, and so I think from a long-term standpoint, Denver is going to come out of this well. I think as, Chris and Brian had alluded to, we're well positioned relative to a lot of places throughout the country. Net migration should, I hopefully, continue to be strong. But in terms of when we are looking at new acquisitions, the forward near-term underwriting is a little bit uncertain, and I think is likely to be there for at least through this year, probably somewhat into next. And then it's kind of trying to determine what the appropriate risk premium is to take on an investment in an uncertain time. I think what you're going to see, and I think you're already beginning to see it, is there's going to be transaction volume is going to decline pretty significantly this year. There's there's challenges with conducting due diligence in the pandemic that is problematic, and there's a pretty sizable bid-ask gap. I think currently, based upon sellers unwilling to think that their property is worth less, and buyers trying to understand what the appropriate near-term underwriting and potential risk premium should be entering into this. So we're no different in that. I would tell you that we're going to be very selective going through this year. The other thing that as most owner operators are really focused on is that the bulk of our focus is really on operations of existing assets and making sure that we're doing the right things to be responsive to our residents, and just really doing everything that we can to make sure that we're managing through this effectively. We're definitely going to be a buyer, but I would expect that it's going to be a lot less in terms of near-term activity until we get better clarity on what the other side of this looks like.
And David, I've asked a number of questions that I think kind of pertain to your world pretty well, so I'm going to let you take your pick at what you'd like to focus on, whether it's the migration question of whether this situation changes, how many people are coming here, or the amenities that developers are incorporating into their building, or the question I gave Zvi about lease renewals and new leasing activity, and whatever is most interesting to you. What's your take on it?
I think, and this is this goes to a few of the questions that we're seeing, and something that I think is critically important, which is we're suffering a massive forest fire in our cities, and what is the forest that we want in the future? That was a question that the forestry folks were asking after the Hayman fire and other big fires. What is the city that we want after this? I think that city councils, there are a couple of questions about thoughts on city council. I think the city council's decision on Cypress, not to take the side of developer, just to take the side of developer, I think that was wrong-headed and misguided. I think that we all need to be focused on how do we support our downtown? How do we make it more viable and attractive and vibrant? Because it's going to be taking, every one of our downtowns is going to be taking just a brutal hit. The things that we were already challenged in our downtowns, the increasing tragedy of homelessness, having to compete on the sidewalk with scooters, and discomfort of walking around alternative means of transportation. I think that now wiping out 30, 40, 50%, Bobby Stuckey of Fresca says his expectation is 50% loss of restaurants, permanent loss of restaurants and coffee shops. Those spaces will become reoccupied, but it'll take a long time. And for city council not to have an organized policy that is intelligent, that says, if we're losing in office, we're losing in retail, we need to be pumping as many people into our downtowns, because that is the thing that is going to salve the economic and vibrancy wounds. So I think that focus of city council needs to be clear. I completely agree, Chris, with your sense of the governor's polis, and led perhaps by Cuomo and Michigan's governor. There's been such even-handed, fair representation, recognition of our issues. We now need to start planning for the future. And this city council entirely, well, 7 of the members got it entirely wrong. City council needs to understand what's going to be left in our fire barren downtowns and deal with policies that improve it. The DDP, fortunately, Tammy Dorr had sent out a very smart email, or the board did, saying, can we take over public works? Can we take over streets to enable social distancing, to give a leg up to restaurants, for instance, to take over streets? I think that those are smart things to do, and city council needs to do the same.
And Zvi, I'm going to jump to you, and we'll make this our final question and make our way around the panel. What does your outlook for the next few months look like in terms of rent collection? And then do you have any positives that you see in this situation?
Outlook is tough. I mean, I think that, the fact that people are getting unemployment, the stimulus funds are out there, that'll keep people in their apartments and paying rent for a while. I worry about the fact that the PPP funds are going to pretty much go away, mid-June. What happens if that program isn't refunded and our economy isn't back to where it should be, which it won't be. At that point, are more people going to go on unemployment? So I think that I'm pleased to see that things are starting to open up, and we're starting to do a little bit more business, but we're not. I don't think we're ever going to get back to normal until there's a good vaccine out there, and who knows when that is. I've heard anywhere from September to 3 years from now. So until that is out there, business as usual is just not an option. And so people need housing, people need jobs, and as an industry, I think we've got to react to the situation as best as we can. Positives, I'm taking a day off tomorrow and I'm going fly fishing, so that's a positive. But I don't know. I think as an industry, I've been very, very encouraged to see what organizations like the Colorado Apartment Association, the Apartment Association of Metro Denver have done in creating resources, task forces. There's a nonprofit organization out there called the Resident Relief Foundation, which has just opened up a fund for residents that are adversely affected. And then, that's between the Colorado Apartment Association and Apartment Association of Metro Denver, and then private donors. We need to help everybody that's hurting out there as much as we can, and we need to be creative and be patient, and that runs from property managers to lenders to vendors. We all just need to realize that we're all in this, and we will figure it out. It's going to be painful until for a while.
Yeah. Brian, positives you see in this situation and/or final thoughts?
Yeah, maybe a slight positive is, I think prior to the pandemic hitting, I thought you saw a lot of folks parachuting in from out of town to do development in Denver. Some of it extremely low quality. I think that this situation might limit the capital to really long duration capital that's looking at higher quality residential, and maybe perhaps there's just a flight to quality. And I think towards the back end of the cycle, we did see just some real mediocre product, low end multifamily being built in Denver, and this might boost the level of quality and perhaps fewer projects. A downside, I think, is a potential flight back to the single occupied vehicle. There was some great momentum to light rail, ride sharing, et cetera, and every multifamily developer was considering decreasing the amount of parking that they would have. It's hard to say how that's going to flush out, whereas that single occupied vehicle might make a comeback coming on the back end, which is another potential downside to this.
Chris, positives and/or final thoughts?
Yeah, I think those were really spot on, both those comments. I'm an optimist by nature. You have to be as a developer. Anybody who knows me knows that I live by the Stockdale paradox, right? Optimism tempered by realism. So that's what I do in everything I do. I think you've got to go back to basics and fundamentals. At the end of any cycle, it was always going to come to an end. There's a revisiting of what you do and why you do it. And to me, everything I do, everything my business does, every deal we do is, what's the value proposition here? What's the appeal of this? And why should anybody care? And so everything we're trying to do is really looking at the fundamentals of deals that we do, of designs we make, of projects we finance and participate in. And to me, that goes for every business, right? Every single business has to now look about what's the value they're providing, because if it's real, it's going to survive. On an optimistic level, we opened up the Denver Design Center on Monday, practicing social distance by appointment only, and I have been stunned at the visitation we've had on a Monday morning all the way through to today. I haven't seen the figures by lunchtime and then this afternoon, but everybody's doing it. And I think that it shows that people in Colorado want to be responsible in the main and they want to get back. And it's just going to be a long, slow journey. But if we stay positive, I think we've got a lot to be grateful for.
Thank you. And Bobby, positives and or final thoughts?
Yeah, it's obviously a challenging time, but I think that there's some positives in terms of how strong and swift the government response has been to this, how much has been pumped into the economy from an economic stimulus perspective with the CARES Act, and then what could come with the HEROES Act that's being currently debated. I think there's a tremendous amount of motivation from not only the United States governments, but governments around the world to throw everything possible at this to give us the stimulus that's needed until a vaccine comes, a vaccine is available. Along those lines, I mean, everybody in the medical profession is doing everything possible to expedite that work as fast as can be done to get therapeutics and treatment. And so on the other side of this, in an election year, I don't think that you're going to see the government pull back and enable, and not put forth the kind of programs they're going to need to, stave off social unrest. And so I think that that's something that I think is positive, that you're going to see the government continue to step up to help people through this challenging time. When I look at, the deals that we have, I think that you look at the financing environment going forward, I think that interest rates are likely to remain very low for a very long period of time. And if you think about, cap rates over where treasuries are, I think it's still, on the other side of this, it's going to be multifamily investment's going to be a good place to be. It's a durable income stream. I think that this proves more now than ever, how apartments versus other sectors, how strong the demand will continue to be as people always need someplace to live. And so, and then lastly, I'll just say, I do think that Denver will be a net beneficiary on the other side of this. I think you're going to see people, as was talked about earlier, not want to live in places like New York and in really dense urban environments, are going to probably rethink that value proposition. And I think the lifestyle that's provided for in Denver should enable us to attract more of those people. So like Chris said, I try to be optimistic. It's hard to do that all the time, but I do think that on the other side of this, that Denver should recover better than other places in the country.
And David, I'm going to let you bring this home.
I think if there is a positive, it's the acceleration of trends. Recessions don't create trends, but they certainly accelerate them. Typically, I think that the things that the highest impact things that a recession does is it creates opportunity. 2005, 6, 7, and 8, we had the lowest savings rate in the U.S. history since World War II. 2009, the savings rate went to 13.5%. It's gone down slightly, but I think that the real estate at its best meets the cultural preferences for using space. And when we think about what some of those changes and trends have been, I think there's going to be an increase in frugality that's countervailing though to the idea of density, co-housing and co-living. I think that downtowns especially need to be able to be the affordable as they were 20, 30 years ago, the affordable option to suburbia. I think that there are a set of things that we need to do, thinking about what happens to societies and cultures under stress. I mean, going back to conditions like the siege of Leningrad in World War II, Sarajevo, poor communities, and how closely they become knit together. They share more. I think that there are a set of things that we learn from this, and our buildings become better and respond to the preferences of a changing culture.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you all again for joining us today. Thanks, Bobby, David, Zvi, Brian, Chris. And thank you to all of our viewers. Hope everybody enjoyed the conversation. We hope to do some more Business Den assemblies in the future, so watch out in your email inboxes for that. And again, thank you all.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thomas.
Thank you.